Great. So Jim, you want me to take it away? I'll introduce Dominique.
Yeah, why don't you? And then 10 minutes with Dominique, and then a back and forth, and then open to questions, maybe 20 of the hour,
Excellent.
or whatever you want to do.
That sounds good. That sounds great. So pleased and privileged to introduce my friend Dominique. Dominique Gilliard is the Director of Racial Righteousness and Reconciliation for Love, Mercy, Do Justice initiative of the Evangelical Covenant Church. He is the author of the book we're going to talk about tonight, Rethinking Incarceration, Advocating for Justice that Restores. It won the 2018 Book of the Year award with InterVarsity Press, a well-known publishing company in the theology and in the ministry world. He also serves on the board of directors for the CCDA, for the Christian Community Development Association, and for Evangelicals for Justice. Two organizations that I think would be good for us as a mainline Christian community to get to know. And also named by Huffington Post as one of the Black Christian leaders changing the world. He's an ordained minister. He served in pastoral ministry in Atlanta, Chicago, and Oakland, executive pastor at New Hope Covenant Church in Oakland, and associate pastor of Convergence Covenant Church. He was also campus minister at North Park University, okay. And I was actually one of those campus ministers too. We were there right at the same time. And then the Racial Righteousness Director for the Covenant Church's ministry initiatives in the Pacific Southwest. Earned his bachelor's in African American Studies from Georgia State, his master's in history from East Tennessee State, and his MDiv from North Park Seminary, where we were seminary classmates together. It was a privilege to learn with and from him, and kind of had a feeling that this day would come, that Dominique would be writing and publishing, and so glad to have us here with him tonight, or with us tonight. So Dominique, tell us a little bit about yourself, anything in your background that would be helpful for us to know, and then tell us about Rethinking Incarceration, what inspired the book, and give us a sense of some of your central arguments in the book as well.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the metro Atlanta area, in the shadows of Dr. King and his legacy. I had a father who worked for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is an organization that Dr. King founded during the Civil Rights Movement. And my mother is what would be equivalent to a bishop in other denominations over the Southeastern Conference of our denomination. And so I jokingly say that God took the best parts of the best call upon their lives and combined it into a call upon my life. Where right now in the role that I serve in, I am a pastor to pastors for our 885 congregations in North America, helping them make connections between race, discipleship, and justice. And so it's a little bit about myself. And then in addition to that, I also have the privilege of serving as an adjunct professor at North Park Theological Seminary through their restorative arts program, which is a program that we house inside of Stateville Correctional Facility. And we have combined learning classrooms where we have free students who go inside and take classes alongside of their incarcerated brothers, and form cohorts and walk with each other together over the course of 4 years, and pursue a degree. And North Park in this program is the only institution in the state of Illinois that provides master's level education for incarcerated students. And so, which is really important because we know that access to higher education behind bars is the most cost-effective and the most efficient way to reduce recidivism, which is people going back to incarceration after they've served their time. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about myself. And we just got clearance to actually expand our program because right now we're just in Stateville, but in the fall, we'll be expanding to Logan. So we can now have some female students as well. So really excited about kind of what God is doing through these programs and showing up and transforming lives, both inside and outside of the prison through what we're doing. So
That's incredible. I wish I had the opportunity to actually learn in that way while I was at North Park.
You and I both. Yeah, so central arguments are big picture stuff. So there's a lot to try to pack into 10 minutes. So let me just share my screen real quick and I will try to do what I can.
And what you don't get to cover in 10 minutes, we can certainly cover in conversation afterwards. So
correct. And I know the number one question people are going to ask is, what can we do? I've already sent Joe and the other leaders a list of follow-up resources that has some slides that actually walks you through what you can do. So not to say that we're not going to answer that question, but I'm going to probably be briefer on that question because I've already sent you out some resources that you can keep with you for that question. So I really wrote this book because there were a couple of books that are out there that are fabulous books about incarceration, but they weren't books that were moving Christians to the degree that we needed to be moved in this conversation. And they weren't books that actually were working with scripture. And so I wanted to write a book that really moved people inside the church, particularly within the evangelical world or with evangelical tendencies, to become advocates for justice that restores, and not just people who blindly supported our nation's rhetoric of law and order that it doesn't have a tangible pathway and plan for healthy reintegration, true transformation, and I wanted to really equip the church to understand these conversations as more than just political conversations, but first and foremost theological conversations. And so, for me, for the church, the conversation just has a fundamentally different starting place, and that starting place should inform outcomes. And so for me, it starts really with Romans 5:38, where we are told in scripture that while we were yet sinners, while we were yet enemies of God, that's when Christ intervenes on our behalf. And so it wasn't once we were nice, neat, polished and cleaned up. It was while we were violators in need of grace that Jesus enters in on our behalf. And so I believe that grace that was first extended to us should inform our posture towards our brothers and sisters who stand in the need of grace today. I think the next passage for me is really important. I'm not going to go through all of them because that would take all 10 minutes, but is Romans 8:38, which it really tells us that there is nothing that we can do that can separate us from the love of God. There is no exceptions in there. It's not that certain violations are so grotesque. There are certain things that we can do that are just so horrid. It says that nothing that we can do can separate us from the love of God. And I think that passage is really important for us as we think about God's justice, which I believe, and I make the argument in the book, is inherently restorative. God's justice always has a plan for restoration. It's not just about punishment, but it's about accountability, learning from the violation, and then restoration into community. And so I take about 3 different biblical examples and walk you through kind of how that's spelled out over and over again within scripture. Matthew 25 says that if you're a follower of Jesus, you're supposed to be present with your brothers and sisters behind jail cells and prison walls. It doesn't, again, no, there are no categories or no distinctions. It just says if you're a follower of Jesus, this is where you're supposed to be. And I believe that Jesus says this so explicitly because he understands that there's power in proximity. Proximity changes things. Proximity changes how we see our neighbors. Proximity changes how we have been conditioned to see the incarcerated. Proximity helps us to understand the gospel in deeper ways that help us to understand the urgency of actually doing everything that's spelled out in Matthew 25. And I believe it's really important to note that Matthew 25 is not just some abstract list of marginal realities. These were all realities that Jesus himself embodied. And so when Jesus says, when you did this to the least of these, you do it unto me, it's not theoretical. It is actually things that Jesus embodied during his time on earth. And so I believe all that's important. I believe Hebrews 13:3 is important. It tells us that we're supposed to continue to remember those who are incarcerated as if we were incarcerated, suffering alongside of them. Could you imagine the witness of the church if we really remembered our incarcerated brothers and sisters in this way, in a nation that has more people who are locked up than any country in the history of the world? Our response would be profoundly different, and it would be transformative, and we would really live into John 13:34-35, where it tells us, by our love for one another, the world will know that we're Jesus's disciples. Like, it's a primary opportunity for us to show who and whose we are through how we choose to enter in and love and respond to harm with a plan for restoration and reintegration. So there's some other passages in there that I do some stuff in the book, and I'll keep going. I flashed this real quick because when we talk about incarceration, sometimes people want to define it differently. So I like to use Michelle Alexander's definition as a starting place. And then I also like to build on Michelle's definition because her book is about 11 years old at this point. And I would add to this definition that mass incarceration has devolved, not evolved, devolved into a sinister system where the image of God is defaced on our brothers and sisters in a daily basis, and it has become a multi-billion-dollar industry where people are exploited for their labor. In addition to that, one of the things we need to understand is it's not just about the time that you serve on the inside. There are a number of books, one of which is called Serving Time on the Outside, that really talks about the consequences our brothers and sisters have once they have a criminal record, particularly once they have a felony on their record, and all of the legal restrictions for access to housing, public benefits, voting, all these different things in which they are barred. And it's important to know that the American Bar Association has identified over 44,000 legal consequences that returning citizens face as they try to re-enter society and actually become productive members of society. And so these are legal things, restrictions that ultimately become stumbling blocks for a lot of our brothers and sisters who authentically learned their lessons and are trying to re-enter into society and actually make our communities better and safer places. And a lot of times we unwittingly support this type of legislation, not understanding the impediment it is to people who actually have tried to turn their lives around. One of the things that there's some mythology around our nation, and a lot of people probably understand this in a lot of ways, but one of the ways that I don't know that we really understand it is that we're taught that slavery in our nation was ended by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. The truth of the reality is that our nation still allows slavery because of the loophole that exists within the 13th Amendment, which says that slavery in our nation is illegal except as a punishment for a crime. Why this is important is more than I can unpack with the time we have left right now. Maybe Joe will ask a follow-up question about that. But it's really important for us to understand the roots of mass incarceration. So most people think that mass incarceration is a byproduct of the war on drugs. The war on drugs wasn't launched until 1971. Mass incarceration has a legacy that's much deeper and darker than that. So really, when 1865 happens, you have the Emancipation Proclamation, and you have a 12-year period of Black empowerment, essentially known as the Reconstruction era. It's critically important to know with this slide that in 1865, when Black people are, quote, when the triangular slave trade is ended, it's illegal for Black people to learn how to read or write. 12 years later, coming out of context where you can't even learn to read or write, 1,400 Black people are successfully able to hold political office in the South. This is critical because it helps us to realize it's never been a question about Black ability, but it's always been a question about Black access. When Black folk were given equitable access, we saw our nation thriving, and we saw equity becoming a reality as we have never seen since. It was unprecedented. So the natural question should be, well, if we saw this kind of movement in 12 years, what actually halted this kind of progress? Well, most of us know the answer, but we haven't been taught the answer explicitly like this. But the answer is the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. So in the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, you have this backdoor agreement that says in exchange for informing the presidential election, they will remove troops, federal troops from the South, and leave Black people defenseless to fend for themselves in the midst of a part of the country that wants to re-articulate white supremacy. And so what ends up happening, why this is so important, is that because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment, we actually start to see that loophole exploited right when federal troops are taken out of the South in 1877. And so this thing on the Hayes-Tilden Compromise real quick. And then with the exploitation of that loophole, you get a re-articulation of white supremacy throughout the region. And I say it manifests itself in what I call the unholy trinity, 3 different ways. So you have sharecropping, you have a restrictive group of laws known as Black codes, which were literally laws taken from slave codes, reinterpreted so they can be reapplied after the triangular slave trade has been ended. And then you have the evolution of the Klan and the terroristic practice of lynching. But with the exploitation of the loophole in the 13th Amendment, you also get this new form of slavery called convict leasing. So if anybody's interested in this, a great book to read is called Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. And basically he talks about how convict leasing really is slavery. It's just rebranded because the triangular slave trade has been passed. What happens in convict leasing is because it's legal to enslave a person as a punishment for a crime, you actually start to see this legislation that's drawn up specifically to criminalize Black lives. And in the midst of people being criminalized, they get incarcerated, and then they get leased out as convicts to do the exact same slave labor for under the exact same dehumanizing circumstances for the exact same no pay. So people are leased out to their former plantation owners, they're leased out to corporations, and they are being exploited for their labor bluntly and worked to the point of death in many cases. Alabama had the best records on convict leasing, and we know that in Alabama alone, at least 200,000 Black men were leased as convicts, and the money earned from convict leasing in 1890 would be equivalent to $4.1 million today. In 1898, convict leasing supplies 73% of the state of Alabama's annual state revenue. So what we need to understand about convict leasing is not just some system that emerged just by happenstance. This was literally a Southern strategy to resuscitate a deflated economy after the triangular slave trade ended. What they had been dependent on, the free labor that they had been dependent on as a region. And so this is really where you start to see the racial disparities and the roots of our criminal justice system. They emerge from convict leasing, which is directly connected to slavery, and legislation that was passed right after Reconstruction. I will skip forward just because I know my 10 minutes is almost up, and I'll just say there are 5 conduits that I really talk about as flowing people into the criminal justice system today. So you have the war on drugs, which most people know about. You can see 1971, you can see the astronomical rise. Then you have the school to prison pipeline, which most people are also familiar with. And these are some of the realities that keep the pipeline going. Then you have, well, I'll come back to that. Then you have the deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities, where we now have 44 states plus the District of Columbia, where there are more people with severely diagnosed mental health impairments who are locked up in the state's largest carceral facility than who are receiving psychiatric treatment in the state's largest medical facilities. This problem is so bad that 7 years ago, medical professionals bluntly said prisons are the new asylums. And in many cases, we are locking up people. Most years, the number is about 90,000 people who are legally constituted as incompetent to stand trial, which means they don't even have the mental capacities to understand why they're standing in front of a judge. And instead of giving them the medical interventions they need, we lock them up and exploit them for their labor. The fourth pipeline, which is a parallel pipeline to the war on drugs, but we just haven't coined it as a war, and that's the war on immigration. And we can see how federal statistics show between 1998 and 2011, there were two things that were driving the mass incarceration on the federal level. All of the violations on the bottom are violent offenses. They either stagnate or decline. There are two offenses that were driving incarceration during this period: the war on drugs and the war on immigration. Bail is a big thing. This is the last mythology I want to address. Bail is this reality. We're told that in this nation that people are innocent until they're proven guilty. Well, that's no longer a truism in the era of cash bail. 75% of people in jails today are there because they cannot afford their bail, not because they've been convicted of a crime. That means that we spend, $14 billion annually holding people in jail cells who have not been convicted of crime. That's $40 million a day. Now, that's not to say that all those people are innocent, but that is to say that people are being locked up, and their chances of actually having a valid case with a credible lawyer to defend them are very much marginalized, if not nullified, because of their incarceration pre-trial. And if people want to know the perils of pretrial incarceration, I encourage you to look up the story of Khalif Browder. It's the quintessential case, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there are some real reasons why this is so detrimental. And then I will end with this one. So this chart juxtaposes our criminal justice system in 1970 versus 2015. 1970 is a year before the war on drugs was launched. The red represents violent crime, the tan represents nonviolent crime. If you can see, there has been incremental growth in our nation's criminal justice system for people incarcerated for violent crimes. The vast majority of people in our criminal justice system are there for nonviolent offenses. They're there for substance abuse addiction, for mental health impairments, or people who are trying to come into our country to flee political persecution or for economic stability through the war on immigration. And they are being locked up instead of getting the assistance that they need. But you would never believe that this is the reality when you turn on the nightly news and you hear our politicians sensationalizing violent crime. And they make it seem like violent crime is the normative reason why people are locked up. And that's why we need all of these punitive responses to crime, like 3 strikes, you're out, 0 tolerance, the death penalty, because we have to keep ourselves and our children safe from these violent perpetrators. And we hear it on both sides of the aisle. On one side of the aisle, there are animal criminals and rapists coming from our southern border. And on this side, they're super predators. Mass incarceration is a bipartisan agenda. It is not something where Republicans or Democrats have the upper hand. Both parties have used dehumanizing rhetoric to advance their political party, and you have politicians who have sensationalized violent crime in a way that's not factually rooted to advance their own political careers. So I will end there, and go into the interview phase.
Thank you, Dominique. I mean, what a sobering and piercing analysis that you bring us in the book. And one that just, I mean, as you go through it, really can shake you to the core, because you just begin to see how the machinery of mass incarceration is so entwined with American history and culture, our racialized society, with white supremacy, and how it has been doing its work for quite a long time. One of the things that I think is a real...
Oh, Joe, can I interrupt real quick?
Oh,
I
sure.
forgot the fifth one. I named 4 things. The fifth one is the privatization of prisons and how lucrative private prisons have become. So that's the fifth pipeline, 5th of the 5 pipelines. So sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. That, I mean, that just adds to this, I mean, feeling almost of just how overwhelming this problem is, because of how each one of those 5 sources that you name could feel as though it is, it's a challenge on its own just to face one, let alone all of them, which will bring me in just a second to thinking about how the church responds to this. But before that, one thing that you're doing well in this analysis that I find really enriching is you're theologizing. I mean, from the get-go, you're talking about the theology of sort of right relationship with God, of the theology of reconciliation, of redemption, and also with the unholy Trinity, the sort of false ideologies, right? The false idols that are in our midst. And one of the sort of theological points that I think Presbyterians wrestle with a lot, in both positive and negative ways, is this idea of order. I know you talk in the book about law and order. And for Presbyterians, we often pride ourselves, at least structurally, on being decent and in good order. We use that phrase from Paul to talk about how we do church business, about how we make decisions, about how we order worship. So in that sense, order takes on a positive tone. But as you begin to unpack this sense of law and order, what might your book's understanding of that teach us in the Presbyterian world about how we use that word order, how it can be misused?
Yeah. So I think, great question. I think it's really important to understand the ways in which, and so for me, a big passage, theologizing, that's really important for me all throughout this book, but within my broader understanding of Christian formation, is Romans 12, 1 and 2, particularly verse 2, where it tells us to not conform to the patterns of this world, but to be transformed through the renewing of our mind. And I think we are socialized to make assumptions about what law and order means, and that it universally means the same thing for all communities. And there's a real hazard in that belief. And so for me, I really want to unpack, what happens when laws don't bring stability, when laws don't create order, but they actually create injustice, when they create inequity. What is the Christian response then? And so I think our history and knowing our history and providing examples of when law has created disorder and injustice really starts to trouble the waters of how we read and interpret Romans 13. And what does it mean to submit to governing authorities? Are we called to submit to governing authorities when they know that their governance directly opposes the will of God? And if not, then what is a Christian ethic entail? And so I really wanted to bring that out, and to address that and to highlight a number of Christian leaders who have helped us think through that and actually articulated civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, as a righteous response in contexts like that. And what does it mean that in the midst of responding to oppression and injustice in that manner, it means that you accept the punishments that come with your resistance, but to acquiesce to injustice is not a faithful response to the gospel of Jesus Christ, especially when you know that it's dehumanizing your brothers and sisters. You know, so yeah, I wanted to raise that up. I wanted to also talk about what does it mean to just have a blind allegiance to anything outside of Christ, and to understand that when we automatically assume that law does equal order, and that law and order equals justice, we actually are people who proclaim peace, peace where there is no peace. And we actually are complicit with the suffering of our neighbors, as opposed to being ambassadors of reconciliation who are commissioned to actually create flourishing and thriving and the peace and the prosperity of our communities.
Mm-hmm. That's really powerful. I think really helpful, because we, I think, tend to sometimes go with the inertia of trusting that our social institutions will function properly, or that, there's a leader in this community or over this institution that seems personable, and so things will go the right way. But often we have to seek a deeper sense of order and realize that just because we think the powers that be are, and the institutions are full of good people, that they will function properly.
And the other nuance, yes, for sure. And the other nuance I want to raise up, and I try to be very intentional about doing this, I think sometimes I don't ever want to be misinterpreted as being anti-law enforcement. One of the things I'm very clear about the fact is that law enforcement's job is to enforce the law. They don't construct the law, they're called to enforce the law. So in a nation that has such an elongated history of such blatantly unjust laws, when law enforcement's job is to go and enforce the law, then they can end up enduring more of the brunt of of society's ire than they actually deserve. And so in a system when slavery was legal, one of law enforcement's initial jobs in this country was to return runaway slaves. Like, their job was to enforce the law. They didn't pass the legislation that said slavery was legal. That's our job as concerned citizens, as constituents. Now, granted, a lot of us didn't have an opportunity to speak into that process back then. But when we look at legislation today, and even the inequity of some legislation that's passed, I think we need to take more responsibility for our job or our apathy in the voting process that actually informs legislation that leads to some of these unjust outcomes. So I just always want to kind of make that distinction for folks too, because the problem is not just law. The whole system is flawed. It's not just one part of the system that we can pick out. The entire system is flawed.
It's like we all need liberation from this system, not just one party of us. Which actually brings me to my last question about what the church's response should be. And I also want to invite folks, as questions come to mind, and we'll shift then to questions from the larger group. Feel free to put those in the chat, or Jim, if you want us to raise our hands using the Zoom app, we could do that as well to field questions.
Yeah, so the church needs the church's response first and foremost. I think we need to understand that we need to be thinking about things like the death penalty, things like things like mass incarceration and the racial disparities inherent within our system, first and foremost, theologically. I think, secondly, I think we need to press in deeper into an understanding of what God's justice entails. And for me, like I tipped my hand earlier, God's justice is not just about punishment. God's justice is inherently about restoration and healthy reintegration after a violation has taken place. Third, I think we need to recognize our system for what it is. It is a system that is built upon punishment and economic exploitation. And it proclaims itself to be a system of reform and rehabilitation, but that is not what our present system is. And Christians need to get involved to advocate to make it as such, make it become such. We need a criminal justice system that is going to create true opportunities for reconciliation, lasting transformation, and healthy reintegration into communities after a person has served their time. And instead of blindly supporting law and order and political rhetoric that really makes our system more punitive, we need to be thinking strategically and intentionally about ways to make our system more restorative. And so that's the role the church should be playing. And I say that all churches should be involved in at least one of 4 ways, at the bare minimum one. We should be involved in prevention for communities that we know that are most susceptible to be trapped into the interwebs of mass incarceration. We should be involved there. We should be involved in visiting our brothers and sisters who are behind bars. We should be involved in walking alongside of families who have incarcerated loved ones who are trying to figure out how do they make ends meet now and how do they make their family system structure work without this vital person who is a part of the family. And then we need to be involved in the work of reentry. And how do we walk alongside of brothers and sisters after they're released and actually welcome them into the loving family of God, and not love them from a distance, but do the internal work that we need to do, that we're ready to truly and authentically receive them as equitable members in the body and not just members who are forever forced to wear the scarlet letter of incarceration for the rest of their lives.
A lot of good work that we could be doing, and some of which we are doing at Fourth and have done in the past. Currently have a jail ministry, which has had to ride the ups and downs of COVID and access to the Cook County jail system. But I would love to hear from others in the audience tonight, your views on what Dominique has discussed. And thoughts about how Fourth might continue to deepen its involvement in this important work. So a question from Kelly, how can churches come together to help repair our broken criminal justice system? So beyond perhaps what we can do as a congregation, how can congregations, denominations across a wide swath of Christian traditions come together on this?
Yeah, so this is where I think the mobilization and the policy work really starts to crystallize. So I think getting civically engaged, understanding legislation and reform attempts that are going on in your, in your state, district, whatever it might be. Know your civic leaders. But I know, so a couple of bigger things. So Chicago has been really in the news and successful, Illinois, in ending cash bail. And that took a lot of people of faith mobilizing across congregations and denominations and that kind of stuff. And with people who are not part of our faith tradition. And that was critical work. I think another big piece of the work for Chicago, 2 things I know in Illinois that are really big right now is trying to get the return of parole. And so Illinois is one of two states in the nation that does not have any kind of opportunity for early release for somebody who has actually done good time and actually shown themselves to be reformed. What you're sentenced with is what you're sentenced with, and there's not an opportunity. And so there are really active conversations about bringing that back. And the other thing is Illinois really has to address prison gerrymandering, which is this reality where when people are counted for the census, and which informs where resources are distributed and also political clout for communities, people are not counted where they were housed when they were incarcerated, but they're counted where they're actually incarcerated. So this is a huge problem for Illinois because they actually have the worst disparity in the nation in regards to people being incarcerated from Cook County, but then being redeployed outside of Cook County, and therefore boosting the political representation and resource redistribution to communities that don't have the same kind of need. And so that's another big piece of legislation. And then I would really encourage you to read, there was a study, 5-year elongated study called $1 Million Blocks that wanted to look at how many single city blocks in Chicago had over $1 million invested in incarcerating residents from a single city block. Chicago ended up having $851 million blocks, and every single one of them were on the south and the west side of the city, which you all understand what that means racially and ethnically. And so $1 million blocks were hallmarked as communities that had high rates of school closures, home foreclosures, and non-white communities. And so that starts to give us a blueprint for what does it look like to start to respond to some of that. So those are all ways that people could be working collaboratively.
Thank you. I mean, lots of ways for us to go. And an underlying piece that I'm hearing from you, Dominique, is a real focus on understanding the system that we're embedded in and that we're contributing to, often without our own knowledge or necessarily our consent. And to then be able to respond as active citizens. 2 questions in the chat. So to the question of cash bail, is it too early to judge if the bail reform is working? And when and how did Illinois stop doing parole?
Yes, so I would say yes, it's too early in Illinois to see if cash bail is working, but I would say that New York was ahead of us. And I think that there's enough evidence in New York that testifies to the success of cash bail, ending cash bail. I think time will tell with Illinois. I would say to have a really authentic assessment, you probably need 3 years of evidence to kind of see kind of what does that mean for recidivism, for keeping our community safe and those kind of things. But I would say if you look at the broader picture of how cash bail is unfolded nationwide, there is enough evidence to actually prove that it's been helpful and successful. With parole, so I want to nuance it because there are actually, like, that's not the language that you will read. So if you look up, like, does Illinois have parole? They will say yes, because there are some nuances that they do to try to jump hoops to get to the yes. But by and large, that is the case. And when did it end? It has been a while. I don't remember the exact date, but it's been at least 15 years that's been kind of a reality. And there have been people for that whole time who have been actively trying to fight to get it resuscitated. But the conversation has been intensified over the last 18 months. So this is actually a really hot button conversation that's going on right now. And there's pieces of legislation that are going forward to try to actually rectify it.
So this is something that we should keep our eye on.
Yep.
As a way for us to get actively involved as things start to heat up with this.
Yep.
Cash bail is interesting as well, Dominic, because nationally, the Presbyterian Church USA has had a cash bail reform effort.
Yep.
When I was in St. Louis for the General Assembly there a couple of years ago, we marched through the city streets and brought a donation for those who needed cash bail to the county jailhouse, and had a rally in front of the county jailhouse. So the Presbyterian Church has made a name in a sense for itself denominationally, nationally, through cash bail efforts. But not all of our congregations and our members know about that.
And the Episcopal Church actually did a nationwide thing where they were actually collecting funds or resources and actually trying to move their people to understand the necessity of ending cash bail. I have a friend who is part of the method, not part of the, what is she? They just put out a new curriculum around
UCC?
Let me look up. Ask me another question. I'll come back to it so we don't waste
Sure.
time.
So here's a.
Rosemary had raised her hand a little bit ago.
Oh, sure. Rosemary.
You have a question, Rosemary?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Ready to go?
You went. You got muted A again.
Oh,
Mennonites.
Mennonite.
all right. I had a couple of comments. First of all, the notion of proximity. This is what Brian Stevenson talked about. He still talks about get proximate to the problem. And when I heard James Foreman Jr., who wrote a book called Locking Up Our Own, you may be familiar with that. He's a professor at Yale Law School. He talked about the teaching in the prisons and how it was working with his students. And so he told me to come out of retirement and try it, but then the pandemic hit, so I couldn't do it, but that's something I plan to do. And also the American Bar Association publishes a list of judges to vote for and not to vote for at election time. And I always take that with me to the polling booth. And one time it took me a long time to get through them all, and they didn't like it, but you know, one of the issues I'm concerned about is prison ministry. I've always had some skepticism about that. And I wonder how your work may impact prison ministry and how it might need to change going forward. I just don't see the prison ministry that I knew of as a teenager being the thing to do right now.
Yeah, so I speak to a number of different prison ministry initiatives in the book, and validate the good stuff that they're doing, but also identify some room that they have to grow. So I think one of the ways we've gotten prison ministry wrong is that, and again, I'm overgeneralizing when I say we, because there's some people who've been doing it right. There's always a remnant. So I think is that we have gone in with the posture that we are bringing Jesus to the prisons. Jesus is already there. The gospel is already at work behind bars. And one of the things as you get proximate to your brothers and sisters behind bars is you will realize how many of them know the Bible better than you do. And that was one of the things that kind of, I'm a seminary professor, and people are reciting chapter and verse in a way that I couldn't dream of doing, and really just hungry and thirsty for the word. So I think that's a very faulty assumption, and that faulty assumption leads us to bad places. Another thing that's been something I've noticed is that men and women will tell you about a lot of people who are very hungry to a lot of Christians who are hungry to come behind bars and to actually convert them to the faith. But they'll say, but those same people aren't as interested in actually discipling me and actually doing life on life ministry and investing in me. Once they get the conversion, then they move on to the next lost soul. And so that's been something that's been also important. And then the last thing I'll just say is this whole notion of saving souls. Like, the gospel calls us to more than just saving souls. It calls us to the whole person. And so understanding what does it mean to do holistic ministry as opposed to just a ministry that's just only concerned about a person's soul, but not their whole being. And understanding that we are called to make disciples who make disciples, not called to make converts. And so, like, we are called to actually be in people's lives in a life on life way that is discipleship and not just about conversion, but actually taking the time to understand the circumstances in which people are coming from and the trauma that has undergirded their experiences and in many ways have formed their decisions that led them behind bars, so that as we're going to be with them throughout the process and helping them as they re-enter into society, then we can do trauma-informed ministry and care that actually dignifies the entire person and actually really equips them to fully give their lives to Christ and not just again, be concerned about the saving of souls.
If I may,
Dennis?
have a question or an observation?
Sure.
Great. And first, thank you, Dominique, for your time tonight. And it definitely seems to me that you're right, that there are way too many people in prison, and that's causing enormous damage to our society and communities in our society. I think terminology really matters, and I've always had a real problem with the term mass incarceration, because that, I think, it sends us in the wrong direction. It makes us think that we have cops going into neighborhoods and rounding up entire communities like happened in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, or is happening today with the Uyghurs in China. And it's not happening here. I mean, it also disparages the constitutional rights that we all have, as imperfectly as they might be enforced. I don't think any of us would want to give those up. I think it'd be much more accurate to use a different term, just over incarceration, which would point us in a better direction and recognize that what we're really facing here is a problem of having too many laws.
So thoughts on that, Dominic? Thoughts on the terminology?
I understand the logic. I would say that there can be instances where somebody could push back on you and say that that's not happening in our country. I highlight at least one example in Tulia, Texas, where there was this kind of mass invasion of the community, and there was an undercover officer who was just at will accusing people of things that they didn't do. And because he had no accountability, a number of people were rounded up. I believe it was a good percentage of the Black community, and at least 20%. And so there, I would say that I think that might be a little bit of an overization, but I will say that that's not the norm. But I would say that when you look at our history, there is validity for using mass incarceration, particularly like going back to the history that I talked about with Black codes and the racialization of legislation that disproportionately led that much of the community into being criminalized and incarcerated. So I would say maybe if you wanted to look at it just as a conversation for today, then I think that would be true. But when you actually look at the totality of our criminal justice system, I think there actually is some validity to using the phrase mass incarceration.
Helpful distinctions. Before we close, I wanted to just note comment question from Lynn in the chat. A question about your thoughts on the path to jail. So talking about sort of the school to prison pipeline, but the path to jail starting when kids are young, and being associated with certain behaviors, values, things that kids might be taught in their neighborhoods or in their communities. Any thoughts on the association that we sometimes make with how children work their way into that jail or prison pipeline?
Yeah, so I understand the question on two levels. I think in these communities that are kind of the, what did I call it? Oh, the $1 million blocks. So kids who are raised on $1 million blocks, I think are there behaviors or mannerisms or tendencies that they might be more prone to engage in, that might be more prone to lead them into a carceral institution? I think you could argue that that's the case. I think what I think would be more productive would be arguing about or advocating for how do we address the disparities that exist that lead those gaps in the community. How do we identify ways in which we can actually start to talk about reinvestment and freeing up that $1 million from creating these generational cycles of incarceration and poverty and disenfranchisement, and reinvest in a way that actually would promote flourishing and shalom and, you know, production. I think that's the conversation we really need to be having. I think that's the most urgent conversation. With that said, I think in regards to the other piece of the puzzle, in regard, when we look at the criminal justice, when we look at the school to prison pipeline, we are most often talking about kids who have experienced trauma, who haven't actually had the root causes of their trauma addressed. And so the dysfunction that happens is a byproduct of the trauma. And we're also talking about the least of these who are actually getting caught up in the school to prison pipeline. So we're talking about racial and ethnic minorities. We're talking about students who have mental and physical impairments. We're talking about homeless kids. We're talking about kids who identify as LGBTQ. We're talking about kids who have experienced physical, emotional, or sexual trauma. These are the kids, when you actually look at the statistics of who's most prone to be caught up in the school to prison pipeline, these are the populations that are significantly overrepresented, particularly the younger you go in the school to prison pipeline. And yes, it starts as young as kindergarten. There have been kindergartners who have been incarcerated, not long-term, but been called, they've had the police called on them for things, and they've actually been incarcerated, usually released shortly thereafter, but it shows how early this pattern starts. And so I think what we really need to be looking at again is what happened philosophically within our K through 12 education system that moved us from dealing with adolescent misbehavior in school to actually starting to move it towards expulsion and incarceration, especially when we know that the National Educational Association found that 95% of people who are incarcerated on campus, who are arrested on campus, are arrested for non-violent offenses. So you would think that kids who are getting arrested in schools are getting arrested for grievous offenses, for bringing a gun to school, or, for beating somebody up or something like this. 95% of them who are called and arrested on school campus are arrested for nonviolent offenses. So I think we really need to ask some questions about why our school system became so punitive, And what does it mean for us to outsource so much of the responsibility for discipline in our schools to law enforcement versus keeping it in-house as it was when most of us were coming of age and were in school? So that's kind of how I would answer that.
Really helpful. Do we have time, Jim, for the final question that Debbie posed? I didn't want to lose it.
Yes, let's do it.
About restorative justice in Cook County. Have you heard of any efforts towards using restorative justice means, mediation, other?
Yeah, so Lawndale Christian Community, their legal center, the Christian Legal Center in Lawndale, was one of, there were 10 communities who were given a special grant to try to figure out how effective restorative courts could be in trying to stem some of what's going on. And Lawndale made the choice that they were only going to allow people who came to them with a felony conviction to qualify, because those are the people who are most in trouble of actually being ensnared in the system long term. So people who have misdemeanors don't qualify for this court, but those with felony charges actually qualify, and they have had really successful outcomes. And I believe that they're going to get a reinvestment in the program because of the success that they've had. In the end of the book, I talk about the different communities who kind of were a part of that grant, but Lawndale and my friend, if you look him up, Cliff Nellis, has been somebody who's actually been helping to spearhead their initiatives over there. And he can give you a lot more information.
Excellent. That's a great connection for us to make, community to community. Thank you so much, Dominique, for your time tonight. Thanks to everyone who gathered to discuss, to learn. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to chew on. And this is many ways the beginning of our own journey towards reconciliation, towards justice. So we're thankful for you, for your work, and God continue to bless and keep you. And as well, what's the new book? It's coming out in August, September?
Yep. New book coming out in August. It is called Subversive Witness, Scriptures Call to Leverage Privilege. And so it's just really looking at the conversation of privilege and what does it mean for us to bear witness to who and whose we are through what we have, and how we choose to leverage or exploit for selfish means what we have been entrusted with to steward.
Wow, excellent. And also relevant topic for our community as well, as we're going, as we're emphasizing racial equity in our community and outside in the years to come. So encourage folks to pick that up when it's available.
I'll drop again a link in the chat if anybody is in.
Excellent.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Joe, for introducing us to Dominique. That was a fascinating evening. So much to chew on. Every topic, so much to attack. Lots of ways to attack this. So thank you for sharing your expertise and your research on this. It was marvelous.
Thank you. And please look at the follow-up resources. That'll just really help you go deeper, further, as much as you want to go.
Yes, email me, anybody, if you need those. I put it in the chat. Reach out to me, we'll send those out. So excellent. Thank you everyone for joining us on this Tuesday night.
Thanks everyone.